Right, let's look at some more terminology. Malware at the bottom we've already described as being a sort of general category for any software that's designed to disrupt, damage, or gain unauthorized access to a computer system. So malicious software or malware. Okay, so, and then three common ones that come up are what we call spoofing techniques and phishing techniques and pharming. You may well have heard of phishing, and you'll notice that the phishing and the pharming is spelt with a PH instead of an F. That's often used to denote sort of criminal activities, and hackers they tend to use that where they change the F to a PH, so it's kind of stuck. Okay, the idea with spoofing is to try and disguise when somebody sends you an email that it looks like it's coming from somebody that you know or somebody legitimate, when in fact it's actually not coming from. So all of these are, in a sense, kind of sort of con operations. Okay, they're relying you to click on something particularly, and that's why links are notoriously dangerous to click on in emails particularly as well. Unless you're absolutely sure, because it's so easy to create a bogus link. So with spoofing, they disguise the email so it looks like it comes from a known or a trusted, and they ask you for money. Or they, with social media these days, it's quite easy to see where you might have a relative that's in South America and they're touring and they're saying, well, my passport's been stolen, can you please send me some money? Or mom, I need some money at university, or whatever it happens to be, and the parent accesses it because it accedes to the request because it looks like it's a legitimate request. Meanwhile, what happens is that they alter the email header, they disguise it so that it looks like it comes from somebody else. Right, then phishing is extremely common these days, and it's an idea where people are essentially phishing for information, okay, sensitive information, particularly passwords, etc., etc. Often luring you to a site that looks legitimate. Okay, so they will say, and often there's sort of an urgent type of request, like your Netflix account is about to be suspended. Please urgently contact us, and or to reaffirm your password, or whatever it happens to be. And the person then clicks on the link and it takes them to a website that might look quite legit, and they have to enter in passwords, particularly on fake banking sites, etc., etc., so that the person then is actually entering the private information on a bogus website, which can then intercept that information. Okay, now often it's very generalized, and some of it's obvious, because if you get a phishing request that comes from a bank that you don't belong to, that's quite obvious. But sometimes it can be. It often happens now, for example, when tax returns are due. The people say, urgently contact SARS for your tax return. Okay, now if you're a teacher, you're going to click on that in a second because you need that money, as most people do, I suppose. So there's a sense of sort of urgency that's created with it. Have a look at the link. Often just hovering your mouse on the link will actually show you what the actual true link is. In other words, don't just look at the underlined part and say, oh, okay, that's where it's going to. Have a look at it as well. If in any doubt, always contact the organization. Okay, so did you send this out to me? Must I respond to this? And in general, you need to be very careful about clicking links in emails, particularly, also even on cell phones as well. Okay, the various types of phishing now. There's even one called spear phishing, where the general phishing type of emails are very general. It's sort of like, dear client, we've noticed that. Okay, with spear phishing, they try and target you so that it sounds more legit. So, dear Mr. Gibson, and they might have your address or something like that. So anything that tries to make the email or the correspondence look more legit, and then they're generally taking you to a fake website where they're asking you to submit something via the email that's private information. Or typically a thing from the bank saying, we've noticed somebody's withdrawing money from your credit card, can you please verify your credit card details, that type of thing. So they panic people into responding. Now the other one that's that's really worrying is because we're saying, okay, don't click on a link. So, for example, if you get a link to standardbank.co.za, check that that actually is a link to Standard Bank and not going to a site that looks like the Standard Bank website. And the other way is obviously just to go and type standardbank.co.za into your web browser address. Okay, now farming is quite an evil one, because with farming what they do is even if you go and type in the address, it can still redirect you to a duplicate or a replica site, a fake site, and typically ask you to change the passwords or give in private information. So the aim of phishing and farming is exactly the same. The problem being, as I say, with farming is that it's actually when even if you type in the correct address, it can actually redirect you. So it's a very difficult one to get around. Whereas phishing, you can kind of use your common sense, but if you type in a legitimate URL like standardbank.co.za and then take you to another website, you've got to be very careful of that, and always just keep an eye on the URL to see that it doesn't suddenly change and it's suddenly some website in the Cayman Islands or something like that as well. So you've got to keep your wits about you. But phishing is probably the most common out of those that I mentioned there. Right, the remedies, making a backup. Okay, now there are different types of backups. For us, a backup is we just copy the stuff and we put it onto a folder. Not on the same machine, please, not onto the same machine, because if your machine gets stolen or the hardware fails, you lose the backup and the original, plus it also takes up space. So put it onto an external drive. External hard drives are always a good investment. Flash drives, these days putting it onto the cloud. Okay, the cloud is just a server or backup service, and there are lots of them. A lot of them give you a certain amount of free storage space, and you can always buy more. Things like OneDrive, for example, is the Microsoft one, and you can store information there, so that if anything should happen to your computer, you've always got a backup of that information. Okay, but in reality, for large organizations, and you think of a bank, we take a bank as a typical example where they're processing vast amounts of information. They can't go and copy the stuff onto a flash drive or an external hard drive. Even copying up to the internet would be a fairly tedious process because of the huge volume that they're doing. So they tend to do it dynamically. Okay, but this is the other approach that you can have. Let's move it into a school environment. Okay, so what we could do at the end of the year, for the end of 2021 or whatever the year is, you do a full backup of everything that's on your system at that stage. Okay, then you could say, right, well, do I need to back up the next time I back up in January, or whenever I back up in January, and it should be more than monthly, obviously, at least weekly, preferably daily. Do I need to back up everything again? No. What you can do is what we call a differential backup. Okay, so we copy the files that have changed since the last backup. So in other words, the majority of files on your system from the previous year haven't changed. So and you've got a copy of that. So what you do is you simply change those ones you back up the ones that have changed. Okay, and you can easily do it by date and say, right, back up everything that's changed in this week or whatever you happen to be doing. And then if you have to restore it, the whole system, so let's just say your whole system crashes, including all your servers, or something burns down tragically, you've got your full backup, which is all the information to last year, plus you have all the changes in the files from this year, the files that have changed. So between the two of them, you can then restore back to where you were at the time of the disaster. Okay, so and obviously then it's a lot quicker to back up information, because that's what puts people off. If you have to do a full backup every time, that's kind of why most people don't back up, because it just takes so long. Whereas if you do a full backup once, say at the end of a year or the end of the month, or whenever you decide, the time frames are up to you, and then after that you just back up the ones that have changed, the files that have changed since the last backup or new, you're obviously having to back up far less data. It's a much more reasonable type of proposition. Right, a slight variation on that, and often people that have these three types of backup is to do an incremental backup, which is much the same as a differential backup. We'll just illustrate it with an example. Let's just say we want to back up all the school's information. So at the end of the particular time slot, preferably say at the end of the year, we do a full backup so we've got everything there. Or it could be done more often. It could be done every 6 months or something like that. Right, a differential backup, we could say, right, well, what I'll do is at the end of January, I will back up everything from January. So I will have 12 differential backups. Okay, well, on folders or wherever I've deemed to save them. So I have the full backup from last year, I have the January backup, the February backup, the March backup, etc. So is that good enough? Well, okay, not really, because if I have the March backup, I have the January, February, March backup, but I'm in April and I'm only backing up the end of April, I could lose everything that I've done in April. So then we can have another one. We can say, right, well, let's do this daily. Okay, so for each day in April, I will do another backup. Okay, but only of that day's work. So I'll do it on the 1st, the 2nd, the 3rd, the 4th, so I'll end up with 30 of those. Okay, again, that's just to simply reduce the volume. Okay, so some people will just, and also to cover yourself as well. Okay, so the idea would be, they sometimes used to refer to this as a grandfather, father, son approach. Okay, in other words, a generational type of thing. So full backup, monthly backup, for example, with a differential backup, only backing up everything that's changed in that month. And then to cope with changes that in that month that haven't been backed up yet, because we haven't reached the end of the month yet, you could have one for each of those days. Obviously, it becomes a little bit more tedious if you have to restore everything, because you have to restore the full backup, you have to restore the differential backup, and then you have to restore all the daily or incremental backups that you would have had for each day of that month. Okay, so make sure you understand that concept, and I think if you can understand it in terms of that example, is that what they're trying to do, instead of having to do a full backup every time, which would be the ideal, if you could do a full backup every day, that would be great, but it's an enormous amount of time, enormous amount of space, particularly with the majority of files probably not having ever changed.